Welcome back to Right Where We Belong by Captain Fluke, the continuation of my series, Storytime with Hollow. This is chapter 5, as I say, and the name of this chapter is On Leave. It's kind of a really needed, I really like it, like little backstory on each character. So that's kind of what this is going to be. It should be fairly short. It's really well wrote. I really like how this chapter goes. It's one of my favourite chapters because, you know, you get to see behind the scenes on each character. Okay, right, we're going to start now. Hollow sat in his small iron cabin in the depths of the heart of Lady Vengeance, its frame iron and barely decorated with a neat and ordered selection of everything he used and everything he held dear around the room. A single rounded window let a beam of light illuminate the slow-floating dust and bring with it a sense of hope and calm. A cabinet, his armour neatly packed on top and his rifle resting against the side. He lay on his bed propped against the cold steel wall behind him, thumbing through the papers of a book as his eyes darted from word to word, losing himself in another novel. Its pages old and crisp, he found a sense of solace and comfort in escaping into its paragraphs. Suddenly, from down the corridor, he heard Rage's voice echo loudly, "Get back here!" which made him blink, stumble and lose his place on the page, and with it, his almost unwavering calm. "Oh, no, don't you dare try and get out again," Rage continued, before making several large clunking and banging sounds. Sighing and rising to his feet, Hollow put his book down and walked over to his heavy steel door, swinging it shut and locking it, leaving Rage as nothing more than a muted, distant rumbling. Turning round, he walked back over to his bed and reached down to pick up his book. Before he sat down, his eyes glanced over to the only decoration on the otherwise solid grey walls. Close to the top of the bed, a single photo hung of him. He stood, smiling, amongst a blue sky, and a beautiful girl with long, red, fiery hair, and a coy grin hugged him from behind. In the corner, delicately signed, "I'll be with you, forever." A small smile broke over his face before he lay back down on the bed and began reading from where he left off. "Alia, you are so much trouble, much more than you're worth," Rage yelled as he slammed his door closed and turned back to his room. "But there's no way out now," he added, seemingly shouting at nothing but his incredibly messy room. Unlike Hollow, clothes were scattered all over as his guns lay across his heavily disheveled bed. A mix of scorch marks and posters covered his walls, with several different themes creating a sense of visual chaos. Towards one side of his room stood a large glass vivarium that contained a mix of plants and dirt. However, it was currently missing its sole inhabitant. "Come on, Alia. I just want to feed you. Why you gotta do this every time?" He spoke as his eyes nervously darted around the entire room. After a few seconds of silence, he heard a slight rustling to see the small spotted leopard gecko poke its little head out from among some clothes. Rage threw himself forwards, managing to clutch the tiny reptile in his hands before she could make her great escape. A small head poking out and darting around, turned back to his room and sighed. Her small head poking out and darting around. "Got you now," he gleefully mused as he brought her face up to his, smiled and then put her back into her home as she scuttled around. Throwing in a cricket for her dinner, he turned back to his room and sighed, putting his hands on his hips. "This was neat 20 minutes ago. You're more trouble than you're worth, Alia," he moaned, before turning his head to look at her devouring a cricket as she turned her big black eyes to face him. He smiled. "Aw, I couldn't stay mad at you. But you're not being let out again." Seemingly unenthused by his response, or not interested, she turned back to her meal before darting under a rock to hide. Ashley sat in front of his large monitors that streamed a constant buzz of words, numbers and codes. His desk curved round and stood in front of a large window that gave him a tremendous view across the entire ship. He sat in his high-backed black chair, typing frantically on his keyboard before wheeling its sideways stick note of numbers on another monitor, then heading back to type in more information. The numbers and words never stopped darting and dancing around and across the screen as his eyes took in seemingly limitless information. Stopping briefly, he pulled out a small box from under his desk and placed it on the table. Flipping open its lid, he pulled out tobacco, papers, some card and a clump of marijuana, which he began to expertly roll into a joint. From behind him, the large doors parted as Gubiak stepped in and walked up to the desk. Ashley paused, looking up at his companion, and instantly noticed his solemn expression, one he unfortunately became all too familiar with recently. Kubiak stared ahead at the monitors, his eyes stern, yet his face contorted slightly. The image of a man who had seen things men should never see. He took a few steps over to the wall, where a giant board stood. On it, the names of almost 100 different ships and vessels were listed. Almost all of them were crossed off. Slowly reaching down, he picked up a black pen before crossing off 3 more, as Ashley watched from the background. His hand lingers and hangs as he draws the last line through. Only a small handful of ships left from the once impressive fleet. Replacing the pen, he sighs heavily. As Ashley finishes rolling behind him and places the spliff in his mouth ready to light it, "We're losing," Kubiak states over his shoulder, his hands firmly by his sides. Slightly taken aback by the hearty chuckle he hears from behind him, he turns to face Ashley, who is taking a long drag. Removing it from his mouth, he replies, "You say that as if we were winning once," before smiling and exhaling. A smirk passed across Kubiak's face as his friend's cynicism brings with it a sense of odd reassurance. Reaching into his pocket, he pulls out a hip flask full of strong Polish vodka and takes a large swig. The bar was noisy and alive with the sound and song of drunken revelers. Its wall beige and peeling with dozens of ornaments of the old world as decoration. Its many chairs taken by a mix of old and young, survivors and scavengers, all enjoying the strong drinks as a way of escaping their troubles and cutting loose. At the bar, and with his deep American drawl now slurred from the amount of alcohol consumed, Tide sat heartily laughing and joking with nearby survivors that wanted to hear the tales of the famed crew of Songbird. Oh man, let me tell you, we were this close to getting all our guts ripped out by a baby Votor because someone got the egg mixed up with our food supply. He bellowed out to the group and equally drunk revelers that had gathered around the large man. Taking a swig of his drink, which he then slammed down onto the already booze-soaked bar, he turned a broad hand around and tapped the shoulders of Fluke, who was next to him, facing the bar. "And who did that, huh, Fluke?" Tide drawled, the turn of his head causing him to have drunkenly regained focus over a few seconds. "Tide, that was you," Fluke responded with a laugh as he picked up his own drink and took a swig, leaving the big guy to spend a few seconds trying to piece it all together in his alcohol-hindered state. His face contorted into one of confusion. It was quickly interrupted by his bellowing laugh before he turned back to the group. "Oh yeah, I guess it was me," as his attentive audience also laughed. He picked up his drink, downed the remains, and gave the mug back to the bartender, who knew the American well enough to get him a new round. "Either way, it tasted delicious," he finished, and the entire group began laughing together. It was hard not to. His upbeat demeanour was infectious. Fluke, however, still dwelled on what was said before and what lay ahead. Finishing his drink off, he looked up at the bartender as he gave him the empty glass. "Graves, can you make sure he doesn't cause too much trouble and gets back in one piece?" Fluke stated, half joking. The barman smiled and nodded as Fluke picked himself up, patted Tide on the shoulder to say goodnight and headed out. Passing through the room, several people waved and said hello with smiles. Attention the talented captain normally relished, but tonight there was too much on his mind. He walked along the long metal corridors that housed a large amount of ships' inhabitants, salvaged from old sea ships and tankers that had thick metal design that carried with it a sense of safety and inhumanity. His footsteps echoed down the empty corridor as he passed dozens of locked doors until finally stopping outside one. Decorated with cute drawings and childlike images of animals, Fluke peered in through the circular porthole on the door. Inside the room was a haven of soft with blankets and pillows everywhere, its walls almost completely covered by pictures and drawings as the faint glow of fairy lights strung up around the corners of the room added a sense of serene comfort and peace. Curled up in a thick blanket and fast asleep on the bed lay Pocket, her face poking out from among the mountain of warmth. Fluke smiled at seeing his crew both enjoying himself, although the thought of what was to come and where he was to take them quickly re-entered his mind as he looked to the floor. Memories of the crew before still haunted him, and he swore it would never happen again. Picking himself up with a determined look on his face, he headed down to the hangar where his ship was being fixed. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep tonight. "For the last time, I know what I'm doing to you is insensitive. Grating piece of software, now will you let me work in peace?" Evans shouted at the glimmering blue companion who stood a few feet away, projected from a circular platform. Sat inside the engine room of Songbird, Evans was arm deep in a panel rearranging dozens of wires and cables in an almost madcap fashion. The AI sighed and crossed its arms. Fine, but it doesn't mean I'm wrong, he responded in a typical sarcastic know-it-all tone. Rolling his eyes, Evans continued to plug various objects into each other before finally moving back and slamming the panel closed. Taking a few steps over, he turned out on a couple of switches before turning to face Duke. Yeah, well, you being right doesn't mean I'm not either, he snackily replied before opening a large metal case and taking out a small blue circular disc that glowed faintly. Returning to the wall panel next to the switches, he plugged it into the flat panel on the wall, and with a click it began to whirl and turn as energy passed through it. Right, finished, I hope. Evans smiled before being interrupted by the smooth AI voice. You hope. You know, one of these days I'm going to remove you, Evans replied as he began walking out the ship and into the hangar. You can't remove me, you'd be lost without my conversation. Who else would you talk to for hours about science and crystals that actually understood you, Duke stated, as he passed from various different AI devices before finally ending up in a floating UFO similar that mirrored the miniature model, that just with more features. Well, then I can replace you. I mean, AKA-SH has been coming a long way, Evans smirked as Duke's face fell. You told me you'd stop working on that. The concern audible as Evans only laughed in response. As they got out of the ship and into the hangar, they were met by Fluke, who walked over to the pair, interrupting their domestic. Ah, Fluke, just in time. I'm about to test the new feature of Songbird, Evans stated, the excitement obvious in his voice as Fluke's face turned into one of a slight smirk. You say that every time. What is it now? New seats? He quipped. Evans paused a moment. Well, technically there are 5 more to hold the others, but it's not just that. The Invis mod is up and hopefully running. New engine ballasts which Tide will have to go over, he replied before heading over to a nearby panel that housed dozens of keys and buttons for Evans to remote test the new components. Well, you're going to have to wait till morning. He isn't exactly in the clearest state at the minute, Fluke replied, seemingly changing direction instantly. The mad scientist headed over to a nearby case and flipped it open. Oh, before I forget, I made you this, he says, turning to face the pilot, arms outstretched and clasping onto a metal arm guard. Almost an entire solid piece of metal, it twisted and curved beautifully, with a large blue screen on the inside. Fluke took it from the beaming scientist, inquisitively, before turning it over in his hands. New armor? He questioned. A small part of, and the rest is in the box behind. This, however, is a Songbird Operational Adjustment Remote, or SOAR, Evans responded, clasping his hands together in a front, almost unable to withhold his excitement as explaining his latest creation. Fluke flicked the switch on the side which made the information panel light up and come to life. Small boxes and buttons, and an ever-moving gyroscope hologram protected from his wrist as numbers began to appear across the main display. He pressed a button. A large roar sounded throughout the hangar as Songbird's engines came to life, causing Fluke to startle for a split second before realizing that it was him that started it. Well, with a look like a kid at Christmas, he glanced up and smiled at Evans. The inventor stood with a similar expression. Complete remote access to most of Songbird's primary function, including this, he said, before reaching over and pressing a key on the panel, causing Songbird to disappear. Fluke, still amazed at how his huge airship could seemingly vanish into thin air at the touch of a button on his wrist, could only manage another smile as he looked up at where he had once stood. Pressed the same button, Evans had turned off the invisibility. You two are getting better at this, he stated, directing it both at Evans and Duke, who seemed surprised to be included in the compliment. And so ends the next chapter, Chapter 5 of Right Where We Belong by Captain Fluke, the fanfiction. And the name of the chapter once again was On Leave. So a lot of backstory there. I think one of my favourite chapters of the whole thing that's been wrote so far because of the backstory on each of the characters. And I just really enjoy this chapter for that reason. Please leave a like if you've enjoyed these, and I'll see you guys next time.